She did not cry. That was the part they would remember later. The part that unsettled even those who had voted against her without hesitation. When the herald read the charges aloud in the great hall of Ashvale, when the words, falsification of sacred records, and treasonous conduct, unbecoming of a council servant, rang off the vaulted stone ceilings and fell like stones into the pool of silence below, Sarah Voss stood straight and still and did not cry. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her chin was level. The torchlight caught the copper in her hair and made it look, for just a moment, like a crown. Then the order came. "Kneel," said Lord Hadron, the eldest council member, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had delivered this particular verdict many times before and found it no more troubling than ordering wine. "Kneel before the court and acknowledge the charges brought against you." Sarah knelt. She felt the cold of the stone floor through the thin fabric of her servant's dress, felt it move up through her knees and into her bones like water finding its level. Around her, the great hall was packed to its furthest corners. Every noble family in Ashvale had received an invitation to this particular session of the court, and every noble family had come. She understood why. Public disgrace was a form of entertainment when it happened to someone else, and she had never been important enough for anyone here to feel the discomfort of watching a friend fall. She was the archivist's assistant. She was the illegitimate daughter of Councillor Voss, who had died 3 years ago and left her nothing but his name and a small room in the servants' quarters. She was no one. And no one, she had learned long ago, could be made to kneel without consequence. Lady Isolde Crane stood to the right of the council dais, composed and exquisite in pale silver, her dark hair coiled at the base of her neck like something sleeping. She did not look at Sarah directly. She looked at a point just above Sarah's head, as if Sarah were a piece of furniture that had been moved to an inconvenient location. Isolde's expression was one of measured sorrow, the kind a person practices in a mirror until it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. She had accused Sarah of altering the treaty documents relating to the Draveth succession line, of inserting language that would have benefited a rival noble family, of using her position in the royal archives to commit an act of political sabotage. The evidence presented was meticulous. 3 witnesses. A sample of forged handwriting expertly matched to Sarah's own. A testimony from Isolde herself, delivered with such quiet devastation that 2 of the council members had visibly winced. Sarah had said, simply and without elaboration, that she had not done it. No one had believed her. She knelt on the cold stone and looked at her hands and thought about the documents she had spent 11 years protecting. She thought about the nights she had stayed past midnight in the archive rooms, rebinding volumes that were falling apart at their spines, carefully transcribing records that had begun to fade, cataloging the history of a kingdom that had never quite decided whether to include her in it. She thought about the treaty that she was accused of altering, a document she had in fact spent 2 weeks working to authenticate after a question arose about one of its original signatures. She had found the answer. She had written her findings in a separate report, filed it correctly, and gone home. She had done everything right. And here she was on her knees in front of 300 people who were not looking at her hands the way she was. The herald was still speaking. Something about the formal terms of her dismissal. Something about the revocation of her archive clearance. She let the words move over her like water, and focused instead on keeping her breathing even and her shoulders back and her face composed. Because she had decided sometime in the last hour that if they were going to do this to her, they were going to have to do it while she looked like herself. She did not hear the footstep. She heard the silence that preceded it. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all notice the same thing at the same moment, and none of them dare be the first to react. A collective held breath. A suspension of the ordinary noise of 300 bodies shifting and murmuring and existing together. Sarah looked up, and then she understood. The king had risen from his throne. Calum Draveth did not, as a matter of general practice, move during formal proceedings unless absolutely required. He sat in the carved obsidian chair at the head of the great hall, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was its own form of power, that a king who moved was a king who revealed himself, and that revelation was a luxury he could not afford. He was not an old man. He was 32 years old, and built like someone had decided to make a person out of winter, tall and broad and darkly compelling, with gray eyes that had the quality of deep water, the kind that reflects light but does not give up what lies beneath. He had been king for 7 years. He had been a widower for 5. He governed with absolute competence and absolute distance, and the people of Ashvale respected him the way they respected severe weather, with acknowledgement of its power, and very little expectation of warmth. He was standing. No one in the room could remember the last time he had stood during a formal proceeding without being invited to do so. He was looking at Sarah. "Stop," he said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the hall like something with weight, like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple it sent outward was felt by everyone present. Lord Hadron stopped speaking mid-sentence. The herald froze. Lady Isolde, for the first time since the proceedings had begun, looked directly at Sarah, and for just a fraction of a second, something moved behind her carefully arranged expression, before she smoothed it back into place. Calum descended the 3 steps from the dais with the unhurried movement of a man who has never once needed to rush because the world has always waited for him. And he walked across the hall and he stopped in front of Sarah, and he looked down at her kneeling on the cold stone. And then he did something that no one present would be able to adequately describe when they recounted this moment for years afterward, because it was so simple and so enormous at the same time. He offered her his hand. "Rise," he said. "You were the only one in this room with honor. I will not watch you kneel. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one." Sarah looked at his hand. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they are not certain is real, something their eyes are reporting but their understanding has not yet caught up to. His hand was large and steady, the back of it marked with an old scar that ran from his first knuckle to his wrist, and it was extended toward her with the kind of absolute certainty that suggested he had not considered the possibility that she might not take it. Around them, the entire court was perfectly silent. She could hear the torches. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear, distantly, the sound of Isolde's composure beginning to develop hairline fractures. She took his hand. He drew her to her feet as if she weighed nothing, as if gravity was a consideration that applied to other people and not to this particular moment. And when she was standing, he did not release her hand immediately. He held it for 3 seconds longer than was necessary. She felt the warmth of his palm against hers, and the strange steadiness it carried, like holding onto something that had been standing long enough to learn how not to fall. Then he released her and turned to face the council, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and would like to make it clear that the decision is final. "The charges against Sarah Voss will be reviewed," he said. "By me. Personally, all proceedings are suspended until that review is complete." He looked at Lord Hadron, who had gone the color of old parchment. "Is that understood?" "Your Majesty," Lord Hadron began, "the Council has already determined that the evidence is sufficient to—" "I did not ask for a summary of your determination," Calum said. "I asked if my order was understood." The pause that followed was very long and very small at the same time. "Understood, Your Majesty," Lord Hadron said. Calum turned back to Sarah. He looked at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and she had the sudden disconcerting sensation that she was being read carefully and completely, the way she herself read documents, looking for inconsistencies, looking for the truth beneath the surface presentation. She did not look away. She did not know why, but she did not look away. "Come," he said. "We have things to discuss." She followed him out of the great hall and into the corridor beyond, and behind them, 300 people all began talking at once. The corridor outside the great hall was long and lined with tapestries depicting the history of Hyde. The Draveth line, each one older than the last, each one showing a king or queen at the moment of their greatest recorded act. Sarah had walked this corridor hundreds of times over her years of service, and had long since stopped seeing the tapestries the way visitors did, with wonder and careful attention. They had become as invisible to her as everything else in the palace that was not directly relevant to her work. She noticed them now, though. She noticed everything with a sharpness that she recognized as the particular clarity that comes after a shock when the nervous system overrides the ordinary filters and lets everything through at once. Calum walked slightly ahead of her and did not speak. Two of his personal guards fell into step behind them at a respectful distance, close enough to be present, far enough to suggest that the king wished for a degree of privacy. Sarah kept her hands clasped in front of her, the same way she had in the hall, because her hands wanted to shake. And she was not going to allow that. Not yet. Not here. He led her to a room she had never entered before, a study off the east corridor, smaller than she would have expected for a king's private space, with tall shelves of books on 3 walls, and a desk that looked like it had been worked at very seriously for a very long time. There was a fire in the grate. He closed the door behind them and moved to stand at the window, which overlooked the inner courtyard where the training grounds were. And for a moment, he simply looked out, and she stood in the center of the room and waited. "Tell me," he said, without turning, "what you found in the treaty." She blinked. Of all the things she had been preparing herself to hear, this was not one of them. "I beg your pardon?" "The treaty between the Draveth line and the Crane family," he said. "The authentication review you completed 6 weeks ago. Tell me what you found." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the precision that 11 years of archival work had made second nature to her, "I found that the original signature on the 3rd page of the succession amendment was genuine, not a later addition as some had suspected. I also found that there was a secondary annotation in the margin of page 7, written in a different hand than the primary text, which referenced a conditional clause that does not appear anywhere in the main body of the document. I filed a report, noting the discrepancy and recommending further examination of the annotation's provenance." He turned from the window then and looked at her, and for the first time since this had all begun, she saw something in his expression that was not blankness or distance or the careful neutrality of command. Something sharper. Something that looked, oddly, like relief. "That report," he said, "was removed from the archive files before the council reviewed them." The room was very quiet. "I know," Sarah said. He studied her. "You knew, and you said." "Nothing." "I said exactly what I knew," she said. "I told the council that I had filed a report and that the report should be reviewed as part of any investigation. They told me the report did not exist. I told them I had filed it. They told me I was lying." She paused. At that point, saying it again seemed unlikely to improve my situation. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the memory a smile had left behind. "No," he said. "I imagine it would not have." He moved from the window to the desk and sat on the edge of it, which was such an unexpectedly informal gesture for a man she had only ever seen sitting in a throne or standing at full ceremonial height that she almost took a step backward. "The annotation you found," he said. "What did it say?" "It referenced a bloodline condition," Sarah said carefully, because she was beginning to understand, with the particular intelligence of someone who has spent her life reading, between the lines of historical documents, that this conversation was much larger than it appeared. A clause stipulating that the succession compact between the Draveth and Crane families would be rendered void if it could be demonstrated that the ruling Draveth line had a prior mate bond claim, one predating the compact's ratification, connected to a bloodline listed in the founding accords. The room was very quiet again. "And do you know," Calum said, with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more careful, more taut, which bloodline it referenced? Sarah looked at him. She thought about the 11 years she had spent in the archives, the documents she had read, the histories she had catalogued, The genealogical records she had cross-referenced with the precision of someone who found genuine pleasure in the interconnectedness of things. She thought about a particular family name she had seen in the founding accords, a name that had appeared with unusual frequency in connection with the earliest Draveth records, a name that she had noticed and filed away and never thought to connect to herself because the idea had seemed too large and too impossible to be taken seriously by someone who had always been told she was very small and not particularly serious. "Voss," she said. He did not look surprised. She realized, with a slow and slightly dizzying clarity, that he had known before she said it. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "This is going to take some time to explain." She sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to Calum Draveth, King of Ashvale, explain to her that she was not who she had believed herself to be. He did not do it dramatically. He did not build to a revelation or construct a narrative arc around it the way the poets who performed at royal banquets would have done. He told it to her the way someone tells a fact, plainly and in sequence, with the occasional pause to allow her to process. He told her that the Voss bloodline was not a minor council family's name. It was one of the 7 founding names, the original families who had established the Compact of Ashvale before the territory had a king, before there were thrones or courts or councils. The Voss line had dwindled, scattered, its members dispersing over generations, until only a very few remained, most of them unaware of what they carried. Her father, he told her, had known. He had hidden it deliberately, had taken a position of minor council service precisely because it kept him close to the records without drawing attention to why he might want access to them. "He was protecting you," Calum said. "He was protecting himself," Sarah said, and then more quietly, "But yes, also me." The founding compact, he explained, included provisions that no one had enforced in over 200 years, because no one had believed they were still relevant. One of those provisions, the annotation she had found, stated that if a member of a founding bloodline and a member of the ruling Draveth line were discovered to be mate-bonded, any existing political alliance contracts involving the ruling line would require renegotiation. It was a safeguard written into the original document to prevent the 7 founding families from being politically marginalized by arranged succession compacts, to ensure that the bonds of destiny were not overridden by the bonds of convenience. Sarah sat with this for a long moment. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that Lady Isolde had my report removed because it referenced a clause that would void her engagement compact if a prior mate bond claim was established." "Yes. And you are telling me that she went to the additional effort of framing me for document falsification to ensure that even if the annotation was eventually discovered, I would already have been discredited." "Yes." Another silence. "She is very thorough," Sarah said. "She is extremely intelligent," Calum said. "That is part of what makes this complicated." Sarah looked at him. At the gray eyes that were, she noticed now, watching her with something that she could not yet name, but that made the air between them feel slightly different than it had a moment ago. She thought about what she was not yet saying. She thought about what he was not yet saying. She thought about the fact that he had stood up in front of 300 people and offered her his hand, and that she had felt, when she took it, something in her chest that she had been trying not to think about since. "Is there?" she said, choosing her words with the care she gave to every document she had ever been trusted to handle. "Something you want to say to me that you have not said yet?" He looked at her for a long moment. "When you walked into that hall today," he said, "I had seen you before. In the corridors. In the archive anteroom. Once in the East Garden when you were reading during your midday break. I had noticed you the way you notice something that does not fit quite right in its surroundings. Not because there was anything wrong with you, but because you seemed too real for the space you were in. Too present. As if you were the only person in any given room who was actually there." He paused. "I had not understood what that meant. When you knelt this morning, something in my blood recognized something. I do not expect that to make sense to you immediately." Sarah looked at her hands. They had stopped wanting to shake. In their place was a stillness that felt less like control and more like the kind of quiet that comes after something very large and very significant has happened, and the body is still deciding how to feel about it. "It makes more sense than you might think," she said softly. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." The days that followed were not simple. Simplicity, Sarah was beginning to understand, was not something that Ashvale offered to anyone whose life had become entangled with its king. Calum had her moved from the servants' quarters to a set of rooms in the East Wing, a transition that was announced without ceremony and received with a spectrum of reactions that ranged from openly scandalized to carefully neutral to, in a few cases, genuinely pleased. The archivist himself, a thin elderly man named Rendell, who had always treated Sarah with the particular warmth of someone who recognizes a kindred spirit in the stacks, had appeared at her new door with a stack of historical texts and a cup of tea, and said, "I told them for 20 years that family had founding blood. No one listens to archivists." She had laughed, properly laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Calum did not come to see her. This was not, she understood, indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. The court was watching them both with the focused attention of people who have been given a puzzle they are certain has a solution. If they look at it from the right angle, and Calum was not the kind of man who gave people more material than they needed. He sent her things instead. Books from his private library, selected with a specificity that suggested he had paid attention to something about her preferences without her awareness. A formal letter granting her full access to every archive in the palace, signed in his hand without delegation to a secretary. And once, early in the second week, a single note that said only, "I have read your authentication report. It was the best work I have seen from this department in a decade. The report has been restored to the archive files." She read that note 4 times. In the meanwhile, Lady Isolde moved through the court with the grace and precision of someone who has not yet conceded the game. She visited Sarah twice. Both visits were impeccably courteous. She brought wine on the first occasion and a small gift of pressed flowers on the second, and she sat across from Sarah in her East Wing rooms and spoke pleasantly about inconsequential things, and all the while her dark eyes catalogued everything with the efficiency of a general assessing terrain. Sarah received her politely on both occasions, offered no information that she had not already given, and understood, in the way that she understood most things, by reading what was not being said alongside what was. Isolde was afraid, not of Sarah precisely, but of what Sarah represented. The voiding of the succession. Compact would not merely cost Isolde her position as the king's intended. It would dismantle a political arrangement that the Crane family had spent 15 years constructing, a web of alliances and mutual benefits, and carefully placed obligations that had Lady Isolde at its center. She was not fighting for love. She was not even fighting for the particular status of being queen. She was fighting to preserve an entire architecture of power that she had built, piece by piece, with extraordinary skill, and she was fighting it against someone she had dismissed as no one, which was, Sarah reflected, the kind of tactical error that even very intelligent people made when they let contempt do their strategizing. It was Rendell who found the rest of it. He came to her rooms on a Thursday evening looking slightly flushed, carrying 3 leather-bound volumes that he set on her table with the reverence of someone placing sacred objects on an altar. "The Founding Accords," he said. "The original volumes, not the copies the council uses. I have been looking for a reason to pull them from the restricted section for 15 years, and your situation has finally provided one." He opened the 3rd volume to a page that had been marked with a strip of red ribbon. "Read from here." She read. It took her a long time because the language was archaic, and the handwriting was the cramped, precise script of someone who had been writing quickly and trying to fit too much onto a limited amount of page. But she read it. All of it, every line, and when she was done, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly. "This changes everything," she said. "Yes," Rendell said, with the satisfaction of a man who has been saying something for 20 years and has finally been proven right. It rather does. The passage in question was not the annotation she had already found. It was something older, something written not as a legal clause, but as a record, a notation in the hand of the original Dreveth founder describing the nature of the compact between the 7 founding families. And within that notation was a description of the Voss bloodline specifically, the role they had played in the original binding of the territory, the nature of the ability they carried. The Voss family had been, in the old language, the keepers of true record. Not archivists in the clerical sense, but something older, the bloodline whose particular gift was an innate capacity to perceive falseness in a document, to feel in their own body when a text had been altered or corrupted or deliberately deceived. It was, the founder had written, a gift without which the kingdom's records could not be trusted, and it was a gift that the Dreveth line had always understood they needed close to them. Her father had not become a council archivist by accident. She had not become one by accident either. And every time she had run her fingers over a document and felt that particular wrongness, that almost physical sense of something being not quite right, a sensation she had always attributed to professional instinct and familiarity with the archive material, she had been feeling the truth of her own blood. She requested a meeting with Calum that evening. He received her in the same study where they had first spoken privately, and he was at the desk this time rather than the window. And he looked up when she entered with a directness that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of attention, the way he had of making a person feel that they were the only point in a room he considered worth looking at. She put Rendell's 3 volumes on the desk in front of him, and told him what she had found, and she watched his face as she spoke with the same precision she gave to every document she read, looking for what was genuine beneath the surface. He was very still. His hands resting on the desk were very still, but his eyes were not still at all. They were the eyes of a man who is receiving information that reorganizes a great many other things he already knew, and who is deciding, in real time, how to feel about what that reorganization implies. "You knew about the bloodline ability," she said, when she had finished. It was not quite a question. "I suspected," he said. "I had no documentation. The restricted volumes were not accessible to me without a formal council motion, which I could not make without revealing why I was looking." He paused. "I knew there was something. I knew it the first time I watched you in the archive anteroom 2 years ago. You stopped reading and put your hand on the page you were working with, and you had a particular expression on your face that I could not name at the time, but that I understand now." She remembered that day. She had been reviewing a deed of transfer and had felt the wrongness in it, the almost physical sensation of something displaced, something that did not sit correctly in the text. She had flagged it for review, and it had turned out that a date had been altered, a minor discrepancy in a property record that had probably been an honest clerical error. She had thought nothing more of it. "You were watching me," she said. "I notice things," he said, which was not an apology, but which was, in its own way, an acknowledgement. There was a pause, and in it, something shifted between them. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of seismic event that stories always describe when 2 people arrive at a significant moment together. It was quieter than that. It was the particular quiet of 2 careful people who have been keeping a distance they are no longer certain is necessary, looking at each other across a desk covered in 700-year-old documents, and beginning to understand that the distance has become a choice rather than a requirement. "The compact review," she said, because she needed to keep herself in the practical and useful, where she was most reliable. "If I demonstrate the bloodline ability formally, in front of the council, and the founding accords provision is invoked, what happens to Isolde?" He was quiet for a moment. "The engagement compact becomes subject to renegotiation. The Crane family retains all other political alliances. Isolde herself retains her standing in court, her titles, her properties." He met her eyes. "She loses the position she built the last 15 years around, but she loses it without disgrace. That is the provision as it was written. The founding families were pragmatic about these things. They did not build punishment into the compact because they understood that circumstances change and people adapt. Sarah thought about Isolde in her silver dress, with her carefully arranged sorrow and her meticulous evidence and her 2 impeccably courteous visits. She thought about the intelligence behind all of it, the discipline, the years of work. She thought about what it would cost to have that work undone by a founding clause and an archivist's daughter who had turned out to be rather more than she appeared. "She will not forgive this easily," Sarah said. "No," Calum agreed. "But she will understand it. That is different. You know her well. I have known her for many years. We were matched by our families when we were both young. She has always understood the nature of political arrangements. She will grieve this one, and she will move forward. She is, whatever else she is, genuinely capable." He paused. "The framing of you was wrong. What she did was wrong. But I have known her long enough to believe it came from fear rather than cruelty. And that is not nothing." Sarah looked at him. She thought that this was the most genuinely surprising thing she had learned about him since he had offered her his hand. That he was capable of this. Of looking at someone who had wronged both of them, and finding, alongside the judgment, something that resembled understanding. It made her trust him in a way that his power and his certainty had not quite managed. "When do you want to do the formal review?" she asked. "The Blood Moon Council session is in 11 days, he said. "The council is required to convene, all members present. If we do it then, the provision invocation is witnessed and binding." He looked at her steadily. "It will be public. The entire court will attend. You will be asked to demonstrate the ability in front of everyone who watched you kneel." She held his gaze. "I am aware." "And?" "I knelt," she said. "I would like very much to stand now. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." The 11 days were not uneventful. She spent most of them in the archive with Rendell, working through the founding accords with the thoroughness she gave to everything that mattered to her. They built a complete record of the Voss bloodline's documented history, cross-referencing every mention across every available source. Constructing the kind of evidentiary case that she had always understood was the only kind worth making. Airtight, sourced, verifiable, with every assumption replaced by a demonstrable fact. Rendell was, she discovered, an extraordinary collaborator. The kind of scholar who had spent so long being ignored that he had developed the particular genius of people who think without the interference of other people's expectations. He had found things in the restricted archive that she suspected the council was not aware existed. In the evenings, she received visitors. More of them than she had anticipated. There were court members who had been present at her shaming, and who came now to indicate, with varying degrees of articulation, that they had not been entirely comfortable with proceedings as they had unfolded, which was not quite the same as saying they had objected, but which was, she understood, the closest that people who lived inside systems of power could come to retroactive conscience, without it costing them anything. She received them without enthusiasm and without coldness, because she had not survived 11 years in the palace by making unnecessary enemies. She also received, on the 5th day, a visit from someone she had not expected. Isolde came alone this time, without the wine or the pressed flowers, or the careful pleasantness of her previous visits. She sat down across from Sarah in the East Wing rooms, and she looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes. And for a long moment neither of them said anything. And then Isolde said, "You are going to invoke the founding provision at the Blood Moon session." It was not a question. "Yes," Sarah said. Isolde nodded slowly. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window for a moment, and Sarah could see in her profile something that she had not seen before, the absence of the careful performance, the face underneath the face. She looked tired. She looked like someone who has been holding a very large and complex structure aloft through sheer effort, and has begun to feel the weight of it in her bones. "I want you to know," Isolde said, still looking out the window, "that the framing was not personal. You were in the way of something I needed, and you were convenient to use. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to understand that it was calculation, not hatred. Sarah considered this. Calculation is not a comfort to the person who kneels. No, Isolde said. It is not. She turned from the window and looked at Sarah directly. I was 9 years old when my family made the agreement with the Dreveth line. I have spent 23 years building toward something that was supposed to be mine. That does not excuse what I did. But it is why I did it. She paused. I think I need you to know that. Sarah looked at her. The intelligence was still there, and the discipline and the capability, and underneath all of it, something that Sarah had not expected to find, and that made this moment considerably more complicated. Something genuine. Not warmth exactly. Not friendship in any form she recognized. But something real. Something that had been present under all the calculation all along, and that had perhaps made the calculation harder than it might otherwise have been. I understand, Sarah said. That is not the same as forgiveness. I know, Isolde said, and stood. At the door, she paused. He looked at you, she said, without turning. Before today, before the great hall, I noticed it, and I did not know what it was. And then when he stood up, I understood what I should have understood sooner. He has not looked at anything the way he looks at you in 5 years. She paused again. I am not saying this to be generous. I am saying it because it is true, and because I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am more interested in truth than I used to be. She left. Sarah sat with the silence she left behind for a long time. She went to find Calum. She found him, as it turned out, in the corridor outside the archive room, which meant he had been coming to find her, which neither of them acknowledged directly, because they were both, at their cores, people who preferred to let the significant things happen without narrating them. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The torchlight in the corridor was amber and warm, and the tapestries hung on either side of them depicting the history of a kingdom that she now understood, had a place woven into it for her that she had never known to look for. Isolde came to see me, she said. I know, he said. I saw her leave. She said something I want to tell you about. But not here. He looked at her for a moment. The garden, he said. It is cold, but it is private. The inner garden at night was very different from the inner garden that she had used for her midday readings, small and walled with ivy-covered stone, the fountain in its center silenced for the season, but still present as a shape in the dark. There were stars. She had not paid attention to stars in a very long time, and they were there in considerable number above the open rectangle of sky that the walls of the garden framed, very far away and very clear. She told him what Isolde had said. All of it, without omission. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and very little surface movement. And when she was done, he was quiet for a long time, and she stood next to him and was quiet too, because she had learned in the past 11 days that silence next to this man was not empty. She is not wrong, he said at last. About what I said she was not wrong about. Sarah looked at the stars. I know. I am not certain, he said carefully, how to do this. I have not done it in a long time, and the circumstances are unusual. The circumstances are extraordinary, she said. Yes. I am not certain how to do it either, she said. But I think we have established that we are both people who are willing to do difficult things carefully. He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him. And the garden was very quiet and very cold, and the stars were very clear, and the distance between them, which had been maintained for 11 days with great care and mutual determination, ceased to make sense in the way that distances sometimes do when you have finally stood still long enough to see how short they actually are. He lifted his hand, and very carefully, very deliberately, with the same absolute certainty with which he had extended it to her in the great hall, tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. His fingers were warm. She did not move, She breathed. "I need you to tell me," he said quietly, "whether the bond feeling is reciprocal. Because if it is not, I will need to govern accordingly, and I would prefer to know." She thought about the warmth of his hand when she had taken it in the hall. She thought about the notes he had sent. She thought about the way the air in the room had changed the first time he had looked at her without the distance he usually wore like armor. She thought about the feeling in her chest when she had understood that he had noticed her. Actually noticed her. Not as a useful element in a political situation, but as a person, specific and real. "It is reciprocal," she said. "It has been for some time. I simply did not allow myself to name it, because naming things you cannot have seemed like an unnecessary form of suffering." He looked at her steadily. "You can have this. I know that now," she said. He did not kiss her there in the garden. That was not who either of them was. But he took her hand again, the same hand she had given him in the great hall, and he held it with the same steadiness. And they stood together in the cold and the quiet for a very long time, and let the distance finish closing at its own pace, which was the only pace either of them trusted. The Blood Moon Council session arrived on a clear night, with a sky so precise and sharp that it looked like something that had been deliberately arranged. The great hall was even more crowded than it had been 11 days before, which she would not have believed possible if she had not been watching the guest list accumulate over the past week. Every member of the court, every council member, representatives from 3 allied pacts whose matriarchs had sent polite but pointed inquiries about the proceedings, which she understood meant that what happened tonight was going to travel. Sarah dressed carefully, not in servant's clothes. She had not worn them since the day she had been moved to the East Wing, and she was not going to begin again now. She wore deep green, the color she had always liked best and never worn because she had always been mindful of not appearing to claim more than she was given. She wore her copper hair down, which she had not done in formal settings since she was a child, because she had been told by enough people over enough years that it was too much, too vivid, too present for a woman in her position. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought that it was, in fact, exactly the right amount of present. Rendell met her at the archive anteroom and walked with her to the hall. He was wearing his formal archival robes for the first time in what she suspected was years, and he carried the Founding Accords volumes with the gravity of a man carrying something that matters, which they did. The hall went quiet when she entered. She walked to the center of it. She did not look for Calum immediately. She stood where she had stood 11 days before, in the same space she had knelt, and she felt the cold stone floor through her shoes, and she breathed. And then she looked up at the dais. He was already standing. Of course he was. He was standing before she had even crossed the full width of the hall, which she understood later was intentional. Was a message delivered to every person in that room before a word had been spoken. She does not kneel tonight. He stood in his full formal appearance, the deep charcoal and silver of the Draveth line, his gray eyes finding hers across the distance of the hall, with an ease that suggested they had been finding each other across distances for considerably longer than 11 days. Lord Hadron, who had clearly been counseled by someone with better survival instincts than his own, said nothing when she entered. He sat in his council seat with the expression of a man who has reconsidered his previous positions and found them wanting. The session began. She presented the evidence first, methodically, the way she would have presented any archival finding. Chronologically, with sourcing, with the cross-references displayed for review, and the original volumes available for examination. She had made copies of every relevant passage. She had prepared a formal notation of her authentication process. She had done everything correctly, which was what she always did, and doing it here, in front of 300 people who had watched her kneel, felt like something she could not fully name, but that sat in her chest warm and substantial. When the formal presentation was complete, the provision demonstration was required. They brought 3 documents to the center of the hall. 2 were genuine. One had been altered, specifically for the purpose of the demonstration, by a council scribe, under Caleb's direction. She had not been told which was which. She walked to the table where they were placed, and she put her hands on the first document, and she felt nothing, which meant it was real. She moved to the second, and felt nothing. She moved to the third, and felt it immediately. The particular wrongness, the almost physical sensation of something displaced in the text. A note struck slightly off-key, in an otherwise clean score. "This one," she said. "The date on the third line has been changed. The original entry was the 14th, not the 4th. The council scribe, standing at the side of the hall, confirmed it. She heard the sound that 300 people make when they collectively reassess something they had believed to be true. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the sound of a very large room becoming very quiet in a very specific way. And then Caleb spoke. He did not speak from the throne this time. He walked down from the dais as he had before, moving across the hall floor until he stood beside her, and he addressed the court from there, which was not where kings gave addresses, which was precisely the point. "The founding accord's provision is hereby formally invoked," he said. "The succession compact between the Dreveth line and the Crane family is subject to renegotiation, as outlined in the original agreement between the 7 founding families, with no penalty to either party and all existing political alliances maintained. In full. This is not a judgment against Lady Isolde Crane. This is the operation of a law written 700 years ago by people who understood something we had forgotten. That the compacts of blood and destiny are not lesser than the compacts of politics. They are prior to them." He turned to look at Sarah, and the court turned with him, and she stood in the center of the hall where she had knelt, in her green dress with her copper hair loose. And she looked back at him, and she felt something move through her that was not performance and not relief exactly, but something older than both, something that felt like being recognized, not by a room full of people, not by a king in a formal session, but by the particular intelligence she had felt looking at her across desks and corridors and garden walls for 11 days, seeing her clearly, and choosing not to look away. "Sarah Voss," he said, and his voice carried through the hall without effort, without performance, with the absolute steadiness of something true. "You were brought to this hall 11 days ago to be diminished. I am asking you to stand here now so that this court may understand what it almost lost through its own carelessness." He paused. "You are a founding bloodline keeper. You are the most gifted archival interpreter this palace has employed in living memory. And you are, if you are willing, the woman I intend to court with all the patience and care that should have been yours from the beginning. The choice is yours. It always was." The hall was absolutely silent. Sarah looked at him. She thought about 11 years of making herself small enough to keep. She thought about the cold stone floor, and the indifferent herald, and the 300 people who had watched, and said nothing. She thought about her father, who had known what she carried, and had loved her enough to hide her, and not enough to tell her. She thought about the strange and specific comfort of a man who had watched her from across an archive anteroom 2 years ago, and had paid attention to the expression on her face, and had not forgotten it. "Yes," she said, simply, without hesitation, because 11 years of careful qualification had been enough, and she was done with it. "I am willing. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?" There was a sound in the great hall then. She could not have described it precisely. It was not applause, though there was some of that. It was not the murmur of scandal or the rustle of political recalculation, though both of those were present. It was something more complicated, the sound of a large group of people experiencing something they had not been prepared to feel, and not quite knowing what to do with it, and doing it anyway. It was the sound of 300 people looking at 2 people standing in the center of a room, and understanding, with whatever instinctive part of them still recognized such things, that they were witnessing something real. Caleb offered her his hand. She took it. The warmth was the same as it had been in the hall 11 days before. The same steadiness, the same absolute certainty. She held it this time without wondering if it was real, without the lag of a mind trying to catch up to what was happening. She held it with the directness of someone who has decided to stop apologizing for the space they occupy. In the weeks that followed, the court adjusted, as courts always do, to the new shape of things. The Crane family released a formal statement, confirming their understanding of the provision invocation and expressing continued commitment to the alliance between their family and the Draveth line, which was, as political statements went, extraordinarily graceful, and which Sarah suspected had been substantially drafted by Isolde herself. She saw Isolde once, at a public dinner 3 weeks after the session. Isolde sat at a table with her family, and she was composed and beautiful, and she laughed at something someone said to her, and the laugh appeared to be genuine, and Sarah watched it from across the room and felt something complicated and ultimately generous move through her. She caught Isolde's eye for just a moment, across the dinner tables and the noise and the candlelight, and Isolde inclined her head, the precise degree that indicated acknowledgement between two people who have decided to occupy the same world without making it a problem, and Sarah returned the gesture, and that was that. Rendell was promoted to Chief Royal Archivist, a position that had been vacant for 6 years, and that he accepted with the expression of a man who has been told something he already knew, but is glad to have confirmed. He moved into the Chief Archivist's chambers with a truly alarming quantity of books, and immediately began a formal project to restore the restricted section to a state of proper organization, a project he estimated would take approximately 4 years, and that he clearly found a deeply satisfying prospect. Sarah continued her work in the archives. She did not stop. She had never intended to stop. If anything, her access expanded considerably, and she found things in the deeper collections that she would be working through for years. Documents and histories and records that told the story of Ashvale with a completeness that the public collections had never managed, and that she understood now, uniquely suited to verify. The bloodline ability was not a burden she had been carrying. It was a capability she had always had and had used without naming, and naming it changed nothing about how it worked, and everything about how she felt about having it. Her work and her life began to overlap in ways that she had never allowed before, because she had always understood herself as someone whose value to the world was professional and contained, someone who existed fully only inside the archive rooms and was simply present everywhere else. She let it overlap now. She ate dinner with Calum more evenings than not, in the small dining room off the east wing that they had both apparently discovered and claimed independently before they had known each other. They talked about everything. She had not anticipated that, the conversation, the way it moved between the serious and the incidental with the ease of two people who are genuinely interested in the same world and have enough curiosity between them to keep the world adequately examined. He asked about her work and wanted the actual answer. She asked about the governance problems he was navigating, and he told her the truth of them, without the smoothed-down version he gave the council, without the performance of certainty. They disagreed, sometimes, about significant things, and the disagreements were productive in the way that disagreements between two people of genuine conviction and good faith always are. The bond between them settled into something that did not announce itself or make demands. It was there the way the archive was there, consistently, substantially, available when she reached for it. She felt it most in the small moments. When she looked up from a document, and he was watching her and did not look away when she caught him. When he was speaking to the council about something tedious, and his eyes found hers across the room, and the corner of his mouth moved in the ghost of the smile she had decided was hers specifically. When they walked the corridors of the palace late in the evening after the court had retired, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled because both people in it are already there. She told him about her father, eventually. Not all of it at once, because it was a great deal, and she had spent 3 years keeping it contained. But in pieces, over many evenings, the way you dismantle something that has been holding you together in the wrong shape. He listened to all of it. He did not offer comfort where it was not called for, which she appreciated. He offered presence, which was what she actually needed. She walked into the archive one morning, 6 weeks after the blood moon session, and found on her work table a small package containing a key. The key was old, ornate, made of something dark and heavy that she did not immediately identify. Attached to it was a note in Caleb's handwriting, which she had come to recognize as clearly as she recognized any document she had worked with extensively, for the Upper East Tower. I believe you will find it useful. The tower had been locked for the entirety of her service in the palace, and she had always wondered what was in it. She found, when she opened it, an archive, older than anything in the main collection. The founding family's original documents, the records from before Ashvale had a name, from before any of this had been organized. Into a kingdom with a king and a court and a council. Her blood recognized it before her mind did. The warmth of it, the rightness, the sense of being in exactly the place she was supposed to be. She sat down at the reading table in the middle of the room, and she looked around at the shelves and the documents and the 700 years of history that had been waiting for a keeper of true record to come and find it, and she felt, with a completeness that she had not experienced before in any context outside of her most absorbed archival work, that she was entirely herself, that the person she was, and the place she was, and the life she had moved into, were not a fit in the way that a key fits a lock, with effort and engineering, but in the way that a person fits into their own understanding of who they are when they finally stop arguing with it. She heard the door. She did not look up immediately. "Well?" Caleb said, from the doorway. She looked up. He was standing in the tower entrance with his hands in his pockets, which was the least formal posture she had ever seen him in, and which she had privately decided was her favorite version of him, the one that appeared when the court was elsewhere, and the performance was unnecessary. "It will take me approximately the rest of my life to work through all of this," she said. He looked around the room at the shelves, and then back at her with the gray eyes that had been reading her accurately since before she had understood. She was being read. "I know," he said. "That is why I gave you the key." She looked at him across the space of the tower, with the old documents around them, and the morning light coming in through the narrow windows, and the sound of the palace waking up below. And she thought about the long, strange path from cold stone floor to this. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not the performance of visibility. Not the public acknowledgement of the blood moon session, or the formal record of the provision invocation, or the murmur of the court adjusting to her presence in it. But this, a man standing in a doorway, telling her, in the plainest and most specific terms, that her life's work and her life were not intention, had never been intention, were in fact the same thing, and that he had understood this about her before she had understood it about herself. "Thank you," she said. "You were always going to find your way here," he said. "I simply opened the door." She shook her head. "You stood up," she said. "That was not a small thing." "No," he agreed, and came fully into the room, and sat down across the table from her, and reached across and took her hand in his. The same hand, always that same hand, warm and steady in its certainty. It was not. Outside, Ashvale was going about the business of its morning. Inside the Upper East Tower, surrounded by 700 years of history that had been waiting for someone who could read it truly, Sarah Voss held the hand of a king who had looked at her and not looked away, and began. The documents in the Upper East Tower were not organized in any system she recognized. That was the first thing she understood about them, and the first thing that told her how old they truly were, because the filing systems she knew had been developed over centuries, refined and revised and replaced, each generation of archivists imposing their own logic on the material they inherited. But these documents predated all of those systems. They predated the concept of a system, in the archival sense. They were organized, she eventually understood, by something she could only describe as association, placed in proximity to other documents that their original keepers had understood to belong together, not by date or subject or family name, but by some other principle that she would need time to understand. She suspected it was the principle she carried in her blood. She suspected that the original keeper of true record had organized This tower felt truth, rather than imposed logic, and that it had made perfect sense to anyone else who carried the same gift. This was the thought she was turning over in her mind on a cold morning in the tower 3 days after Calum had given her the key, when Rendell arrived with a thermos of tea and the expression of a man who has found something he cannot quite believe. "You need to see this," he said, setting the thermos on the corner of her work table and placing in front of her a document that she recognized immediately. The handwriting, the quality of the ink, the particular way the parchment had aged. It was from the same collection as the passage in the Founding Accords that had begun all of this. But it was not from the Founding Accords. It was older. She read it. It took her some time because the archaic script required her full concentration, and she read it 3 times to be certain she understood what she was reading. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and breathed. "Rendell," she said. "I know," he said, and poured her tea with the air of a man providing emergency supplies. "This was written before the compact. Before the original founding compact, yes, by approximately 40 years. She looked at the document again. It was a record, made by someone whose name she did not recognize, describing a bond observed between 2 people from 2 specific families. The families were named. The bond was described in the language of the time, with a precision that told her the writer had been someone who understood what they were documenting. And at the bottom, in a different hand, a notation. A notation that said, in the archaic script of the period, that this bond had been the reason for the compact. That the compact had not created an arrangement between the founding families. It had been written in recognition of something that already existed. The Voss and Draveth bond had been the founding of Ashvale, not a consequence of it. Not a secondary clause. The original reason. She brought this to Calum that evening, and he read it with the same stillness he brought to everything significant. And then he set it down on the desk and looked at her. And in his gray eyes was something she had not seen in them before, which was the specific quality of a person who has just understood that something they thought was new is, in fact, very old. "We have been here before," he said. "Someone like us has," she said. "A very long time ago. And they built a kingdom out of it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We have more documents to go through." "Years of them," she agreed. "Then we should get started." She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has been given exactly the right amount of work and exactly the right company to do it with. And he saw it. And the ghost of his own smile came back to him. The real one. The one she was still learning the full shape of. He stood and moved to stand beside her. At the desk, not across from her, beside her. And they looked at the document together in the lamplight. And Ashvale settled around them with the comfortable solidity of a place that has been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this. She had come to the palace at 17 with her father's name and nothing else. She had spent 11 years becoming invisible in service of a kingdom that had not yet decided whether she was worth seeing. She had knelt on cold stone in front of 300 people, and she had not cried, and a king had risen and offered her his hand, and in the offering had changed the gravity of her world. She had found her bloodline in a tower of documents that had been waiting for her specific hands. She had stood in the center of the great hall in green and copper, and refused to be the size she had been assigned. She had always been the keeper of true record. She understood that now, not as a title or a provision in a 700-year-old compact, but as the truest description of who she was. She kept true record. She perceived falseness. She found what was real beneath what was presented. She had done it with documents for 11 years. She was learning to do it with her own life. She was learning to let what was true about her be simply and quietly present, without apology, and without the endless internal negotiation she had always conducted between her actual self and the self she had been told to be. Calum reached across and turned the next page of the document. His hand was close to hers on the parchment. The lamplight was warm. The tower was quiet around them, full of the presence of 700 years of history that was, she now understood, partly hers to steward. "What does this section say?" he asked. He was learning the archaic script. He had been learning it since the day she had brought him the first document, with the focused determination of a man who has decided that a thing is worth the effort and does not revisit that decision. She looked at the page. She read the passage and translated it in her head, and then spoke it aloud for him. And as she did, she felt the rightness of it in her blood, the clean, clear sensation of a true thing being truly read. No wrongness, no displacement, no note struck off key. Only this, only the truth of it, plain and present and hers.